Hello and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Now, if you remember last week, I went through Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. It really just clarified how he conceptualizes the reality of God. And the reason for that was because this week, I'm going to be covering a paragraph out of Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil. And Descartes is referenced in the second sentence. So I'll read the passage in its entirety, and then I'll go back and go through it sentence by sentence. What does all modern philosophy mainly do? Since Descartes, and indeed more in defiance of him than on the basis of his procedure, an attentat has been made on the part of all philosophers on the old conception of the soul under the guise of a criticism of the subject and predicate conception. That is to say, an attentat on the fundamental presupposition of Christian doctrine. Modern philosophy, as epistemological skepticism, is secretly or openly anti-Christian, although for keener ears be it said, by no means anti-religious. Formerly, in effect, one believed in the soul as one believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. One said I is the condition, think is the predicate and is conditioned. To think is an activity for which one must suppose a subject as cause. The attempt was then made with marvelous tenacity and subtlety to see if one could not get out of this net, to see if the opposite was not perhaps true. Think, the condition, and I, the conditioned. I, therefore, only a synthesis which has been made by thinking itself. Kant, Immanuel Kant, really wished to prove that, starting from the subject could not be proved, nor the object either. The possibility of an apparent existence of the subject, and therefore of the soul, may not have always been strange to him, the thought which once had an immense power on earth as the Vedanta philosophy. So, Nietzsche covers quite a bit in this paragraph. He references Descartes, and then he references Immanuel Kant, which I'll cover a bit of Kant when we get down there to the end of this paragraph. But if you remember, Descartes was saying that he was sure of the reality of God because for an all-powerful being to be all-powerful, it must be real, it must be in existence, and those two things are inextricably tied, meaning that you can't have a high point without a low point for reference. It's the same kind of understanding with God. You can't have an all-powerful being that doesn't exist. And to be able to conceptualize an all-powerful being, there had to be something that implanted that thought. And I'm not going into what I think on Immanuel Kant or on Rene Descartes. I'm not going into what I think on their philosophy. I'm just straight up saying what they think, because by no means have I read enough of their philosophy to really be able to justify a solid opinion on it. But I do see some places where I think Rene Descartes, and when I cover Immanuel Kant a little later on, there are some places where I think that they might have went wrong, which I might cover at another time when I've gone into their philosophy a bit more. But for the most part, I'm going to be telling you just what you need to know to understand this Nietzsche paragraph here. The first bit here, what does all modern philosophy mainly do? Since Descartes, and indeed more in defiance of him than on the basis of his procedure, an attentat has been made on the part of all philosophers on the old conception of the soul, under the guise of a criticism of the subject and predicate conception. So, attentat is a French and a German word, and it means assassination attempt. And what I started to think of with this is, what is the purpose of an assassination attempt? You don't just try to assassinate somebody that you don't like. There's a reason that you want them dead. And the reason is because you want them to stop more or less effectuating their being in the world. You want to influence the future by stopping their influence on the future. So when Nietzsche is talking about this and he says that this assassination attempt has been made on the part of all philosophers on the old conception of the soul, so the philosophers are trying to assassinate the old conception of the soul under the guise of a criticism of the subject and predicate conception. In other words, they're trying to get out of this net of thinking that the predicate had to be caused by the subject. And that's why Nietzsche also says that it's an assassination attempt on the fundamental presupposition of Christian doctrine. Because the fundamental presupposition of Christian doctrine is that you have control over your own actions. It's that you are the subject to your predicate. And Nietzsche is also saying something about the morality of these philosophers when he says that they're indeed more in defiance of Descartes than on the basis of his procedure. Because remember, Descartes' procedure was breaking everything down to the smallest pieces that he could to reason away each piece, to reason each piece individually and try to come to a conclusion based on that. So instead of using his procedure to go ahead and break down the subject and predicate conception, they're going ahead and just trying to disprove the reality of God. And that's also why Nietzsche says that modern philosophy is secretly or openly anti-Christian, although for keener ears be it said by no means anti-religious. So they're very anti-Christian, and this kind of ties into what something Nietzsche was saying earlier in the book when he's talking about postmodernists, really, without saying postmodernists. But he's talking about people who want to tear down everything, the structure around them, the world that they've built, that their ancestors really have built. Not that they've built, but that their ancestors built. And he says that it's not because they're trying to get to something better. They're trying to run from what they were. And this is the same kind of idea here, where he's saying that modern philosophers aren't trying to get somewhere better. They're just trying to tear down this idea of God and the Christian God, really. That's why he says anti-Christian, but by no means anti-religious, because they do have their own religions. And in many ways, atheists are some of the most virulently religious people in society nowadays. And it's because they feel like they're incredibly anti-religious, and anyone who believes in theistic religions is stupid. And really, that just makes them more dogmatic in their ideology. Then Nietzsche says, formerly in effect, one believed in the soul as one believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. So what he's saying is that people thought of the soul as being similar to grammar in the sense that you needed a subject and then a predicate the same way you do in grammar. He said, one said, I is the condition, think is the predicate and is conditioned. To think is an activity for which one must suppose a subject as cause. Because remember, it was René Descartes who said, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum. And this is why Nietzsche says the attempt was then made with marvelous tenacity and subtlety to see if one could not get out of this net, to see if the opposite was not perhaps true. Think the condition and I the conditioned. I, therefore, only a synthesis, which has been made by thinking itself. So this goes back to the defiance of Descartes, where the philosophers were trying to disprove him in defiance of him, because he had this idea of I think, therefore I am, and they tried to turn it around saying that I was just a synthesis created by thinking. And as Nietzsche says, it was done with marvelous tenacity and subtlety. And then Nietzsche mentions Kant because Immanuel Kant was one of these philosophers trying to assassinate the old conception of the soul, more in defiance of Descartes. That's why Nietzsche says Kant really wished to prove that, starting from the subject could not be proved, nor the object either. The possibility of an apparent existence of the subject, and therefore of the soul, may not always have been strange to him. Now, it would help at this point, I guess, to go into Kant's philosophy a little bit, because what Immanuel Kant, what the main purpose of his philosophy was, or the main building block that it was built on, was synthetic a priori knowledge. Now, Kant's entire philosophy, like I said, rests on this, and the way that Kant broke this down is into two categories. You have a priori knowledge and you have empirical knowledge, and then you have analytic judgments, and you have synthetic judgments. Now, empirical knowledge is basically sensory input, and this includes all of the sciences. It's just sensory input, it's doing testing that can be perceived through the senses. And then a priori knowledge, it isn't justified by appealing to senses. It's things that are true by definition. And one of the things that Kant thinks is a priori is math, saying that 7 plus 5 equals 12, where there's no place in the world where 7 plus 5 doesn't equal 12, and you don't have to visualize 7 objects and 5 objects and then count them up and get 12. And a priori knowledge is necessary and it's universal. And then when he gets into judgments, you have the analytic judgments, which analytic judgments are essentially saying that the predicate is contained in the subject. So, meaning it's true by definition. And then synthetic judgments, they take the subject and they connect a new concept to it. So a classic example is like saying the unmarried bachelor is an example of an analytic judgment, because the term unmarried is contained in the term bachelor. Whereas if you say the bachelor is happy or the bachelor is sad, that's now a synthetic judgment, because you're taking the subject of the bachelor and you're connecting a new concept to it. And this connects new information to the subject. So what this means is that analytic judgments are a priori, which are essentially relations of ideas, and then empirical knowledge is synthetic, where things are a matter of fact. They're just facts. Now, originally, Kant saw the world as divided into these two subjects, and he said that that was wrong. He said that that's not all that there is. And that's when he conceptualized the synthetic a priori knowledge. And Kant's example of this was that a triangle has 180 degrees. And you don't need your senses to know that, and it's universal, but he saw it as new information. There's nothing inherent in a three-sided shape that says it has to have 180 degrees. Kant saw this as synthetic a priori knowledge. And he saw philosophy as necessary and universal, so therefore it's a priori, but it's not full of definitional truths, so therefore it's synthetic. So he saw philosophy as synthetic a priori knowledge. And it was using this synthetic a priori knowledge that Kant wished to prove that the subject could not be proved, nor the object either. And this is where Nietzsche says the possibility of an apparent existence of the subject, and therefore of the soul, may not always have been strange to him, because that's what synthetic a priori knowledge is. It's knowledge of something that's not based on any definitional truths, but it's things that are universally true and universally necessary. And Nietzsche connects this back to the soul, because the soul isn't something that can be sensed, and it's not true by definition. So it falls outside of the realm of empirical or analytic. You can almost see where Nietzsche really draws the line between Kant and Descartes, where he's saying that Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," drawing a line between the subject and the predicate. But Kant goes outside of that, talking about an apparent existence of the subject and therefore of the soul. But this isn't by any means the first time in this book that Nietzsche has taken issue with Immanuel Kant's philosophy. And perhaps I'll get into that another time, but for now, that's my explanation on the paragraph of Nietzsche connecting Descartes and Immanuel Kant, talking about modern philosophers, or, modern for the mid to late 1800s, and how they're openly anti-Christian, but by no means anti-religious. They're very religious. They have a God. Really, with Nietzsche's conception of religion, you can't have somebody who's not religious, because they're going to have a value structure, and they're going to have somebody who's the ideal. There's going to be somebody at the top. The real difference that I see is between a God that's above man and a God that is man. And if you look at some of the societies that have been considered godless or anti-religious, you look at the Soviet Union, you look at Hitler's Germany, you look at Pol Pot's Cambodia, all of these places and many, many more that were run by authoritarian regimes were not godless. They were just anti-theistic. They were against having a God that's greater than man. This is why Nietzsche says that people should be looking at the world as truth versus untruth, not good versus evil or morality versus sin. It's truth and untruth. And then he defines truth in the sense of furthering life. And there is a difference between objective truth and absolute truth, which I'll probably cover at some point. But I've already covered it on the channel, here and there in some of the live streams. But for the most part, that covers this paragraph on Nietzsche pretty well. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I really appreciate all of the support on Patreon. And I'll see you guys next week.